Thanks everybody for coming in this morning. I know you had a lot of choices. And this panel is especially pointed towards the larger the cohort that's going to be here, the CEOs who are either at startups or it's your first one or it's your fifth one. And we had discussed this, and it's your 180-day playbook. And not necessarily the very first 180 days as a CEO, but 180 days from let's start today and what we're trying to take off on. So let me first start by allowing each of the gentlemen to share their background so you have some relevance and awe about what they've accomplished in their career so far to date. So Bernie, would you open us up?
Thanks, Joe, and thanks LSI for having us here. My background includes having run two venture-backed companies in the device space, one in ophthalmology, one in endoscopic suturing, currently on 3 boards, one in oncology, one in spine, and another that's a CRO. And I also have a thriving advisory practice that where we work primarily with newly appointed CEOs.
And I'm Cason Kynes. I'm a investor and an operator. I'm a partner at Ajax Health. Ajax has a hybrid, investing and operating model. So I've been at Ajax now for 6 years, worked very closely with Duke Rolene, who's the CEO and founder at Ajax. But I've also served as very involved in our Cordis acquisition and associated with that acquisition, ramping up an accelerator that we've established to introduce innovation to that company. And then more recently, for the last 2 years, I served as the chief operating officer of a business called Cortex, which was one of our portfolio companies that we just sold to Boston Scientific a couple months ago.
I'm Hanson Gifford. I've been in the medical device space 42 years now, all of it in startup device companies. Starting in interventional cardiology, went to Germany and started a company there. Could talk about what not to do in your first 180 days. Then ran R&D at Hartport, less invasive cardiac surgery, and for the past 26 years have run the Foundry, where we're inventing new things and starting companies in a variety of spaces. I'm also a partner at Lightstone Ventures.
Outstanding. So in sessions like this, I like to open up with this thoughtful quote that I wish I had penned, but I think it's very appropriate for this one. I'm glad I paid so little attention to the good advice. Had I abided by it, I might have been saved from some of my most valuable mistakes. So I've asked our panel to make sure that while we talk about the wins we had, if we had a mulligan or do-over, what would we have thought about in setting up our leadership and our organizations? So Bernie, let me just open up with you first. When we think about a 180-day playbook as a CEO, how do you level set? What is your baseline reference that you think of most as you give consulting insights to your clients?
Well, Joe, I think there are 4 things, and each of which are fundamental. First is establishing a long-range vision and set of goals that are aspirational for the company, not a sort of a 1-year plan, but 3 to 5 years. Where are we going to be, and how great it's going to be when we get there? That's kind of a keystone, I think, as you build a system. Helps guide decisions and actions towards that aspirational future state. Second is culture. How must we behave along the way? And establishing that in a stretch fashion, right? Behaviors that aren't necessarily easy, but require a reach. Third, I think, is a vital few set of priorities, and fourth is a common language or methodology for execution.
And when we think about that list of things that we want to accomplish, Hanson, I'll throw this to you as a fellow engineer. Do you ever think about that list being too long? Do we Pareto that list? How do we approach that list of things to accomplish?
You try to boil it down, as Bernie was saying, the vital few. Establishing clear communication with the team is important. And if you have a list of 10 things, you might as well not have a list. It's a very few things that you can really get the team focused on. And so defining those is super important. And defining those few with your board as well. You're managing in both directions. You have to establish that communication with the board, establish an understanding with each of the board members, and make sure that that there's alignment there.
Cason, with the Cortex successful outcome, take us through on the same talking point, how you got from here to there.
Yeah, the prioritization of trade-offs was a big part of the narrative of that company. There was a meeting that we had after we had raised $90 million financing at the end of 2023. And not too long after that, we had a strategy meeting where we were getting together a team. We had a team in Munich that was driving the software component, a team in Santa Clara that was driving the hardware component. We brought all the leaders of the business into a room. And in preparation for that meeting, I was engaging with all the functional leaders, trying to gather their perspectives of what should those vital few priorities be for this organization. And I realized there were a lot of different perspectives across the organization, and we weren't on the same page in terms of what was going to optimize the pathway to value creation for the business. And what we ended up doing, I remember realizing, like, how do we need to do something to get this organization on the same page. And it was about 2 nights before that strategy meeting, I sat down with a blank Word document up on my computer, and I wrote 3 questions. What do we have? What do we need? And what should we do? And I took an initial stab at writing a 4-page memo that tried to answer each of those questions from the best of my perspective. Ended up sending that out to the team prior to that meeting and asking everybody to read this with a mind of like intense criticism, like find out where I'm wrong, come up with a different perspectives. What facts do I have wrong? What are the errors in my assumptions or my deductions that I'm making from those assumptions? And we had a really productive meeting that did really impact the direction of that organization. I think it's very similar to the exercise that you mentioned in terms of identifying those vital few priorities and getting a team oriented around those objectives.
Hanson, I want to throw this back to you. So if we think about the CEOs in this room, and especially first-time CEOs, a lot of times you get that head nod because you had, as an individual, had taken authority, risen to a challenge a number of times in your career, usually on an individual basis, and executed. And that's usually like the best player sometimes gets thrown up to be the coach. But when you move into this startup world, you've got to have this adaptive challenge that you have to take on, but your team has to now solve the problems. And so as you coach these CEOs through, what are the watch outs or the guardrails of not being an opera singer, me, but them, and the solution is in the team?
Yeah, well, you're alluding to a key point, which is that when you get to the point where you're running the company, even if it's a relatively small company, you can't do everything. You can't make all the decisions and just let people execute. First of all, there's just not enough time in the day. Second of all, you're really going to sub-optimize your outcomes because you're only using your mind, and everyone's going to sit there and look for you to give the answers. We've all been in meetings in every setting, especially when you're out pitching to raise money, where within 3 minutes you can see that everybody in the room, there might be 5 people from that venture fund in the room, but they're all looking to one person to make a decision. And that's not how you want to run a company. So being willing to empower people to make decisions, to force them to think it through, and certainly to help them, to provide them with your thoughts and so on, but let them create that, and you're managing them, not doing their work for them. It's a really tough transition because you've already been doing it. You can do that job faster than they can, and you can do that job faster than they can, and you can't do them all faster than they can, and it's not going to work. So that's a challenge of growth as a leader. broadly, but it's super important as you come into run a company.
Hanson used the term forced a decision. And Bernie, you were a little sort of humble with some of the leadership sort of consigliere you've done with guys like Palmisano, with Wright, and with EB3. And forcing a decision in your system, you force decisions in a forced voting environment. Share that with the group here.
Sure, but we use forced voting on priorities for the customer, for the employee, and for the shareholder, and it usually starts out as a brainstorm.
And this is could be the whole company, depending on how big it is.
Yeah, it could be the whole company. We did this work at Cordis. I think the first meeting was 65 executives globally, 40 of whom were in the room, and 20 or so were on Zoom. And we brainstormed each of those three areas. We had some data and information. We had customer survey, we had employee survey, and we understood kind of where the shareholder wanted to go. And then you bring the management team together and you say, okay, what are all the things that we can do to drive improved customer satisfaction, customer experience, employee engagement, and shareholder value. And those lists typically end up being, 20 or 30 different things. And then you give each participant 10 votes electronically, and it forces, to your earlier term, a Pareto, a list of sort of the 20% of the items that are going to close 80% of the gap. And that is where you find, at least initially, your vital few priorities. It doesn't mean you're not going to do the other 80%. It just means that you're going to put your best people, best resources on those most important things. But it's to what Hanson was saying, it's a team sport. It's not the CEO in the corner of the building decide. And in fact, in many cases, the CEO would come to the same decision on his or her own. It's bringing everybody along for that journey with you.
Cason, when you successfully moved Cortex through the transaction, did you experience a similar or a process you went through as well?
Yeah, I would say another thing that we think about as one of the primary roles of a CEO is to hold the pen on the narrative of a company. And it's one thing to have a vision, it's one thing to have a strategy. It's another thing to be able to communicate that vision and strategy in a really compelling way. I think as human beings, be we an investor who might be thinking about investing in your company, an employee you're trying to hire and retain, or a business development leader at a potential buyer, like we as human beings are compelled by stories and narratives. But it's to Bernie's point, it's not you don't develop that in isolation by yourself as a CEO. You have to solicit the input. You need, if you're a non-technical CEO, you're going to need the input of the technical team. If you're a non-clinical CEO, you're going to need input of clinical folks on your team to piece a narrative together. But in order for a narrative to be compelling, it can't be convoluted. It has to be concise and understandable, and it has to be compelling and be able to be delivered with conviction. I think that narrative is another thing that can be a forcing function for a CEO to figure out what the vital priorities ought to be. Because if you can't tell a compelling narrative about your company, you're not going to be able to raise capital, and you're not going to be able to sell a company, and you're also not going to be able to recruit and retain great people to be a part of that narrative. And so at Cortex, that was a big part of what we did when we had brought a couple companies together that had a backstory to them, and now we're creating a new story for that collective organization. And in order to help figure out what those vital priorities ought to be, one of the exercises we went through was getting rid of every slide we had ever created and starting a new slide deck from scratch in conjunction with people who had been there and had perspectives that could contribute to the development of that narrative and constructing that narrative together in a very iterative process, soliciting input from a lot of people who are involved in the company.
So there's probably 80% of this audience here has got a slide deck that's probably dated, legacy, and and I could hear the giggles, right? That needs to be reimagined and rethought, one for fundraising, one for attracting talent, and one for being highly focused on those vital few. Hanson, what would be your guidance be? Let's just start there as a takeaway. What would your guidance be to everybody sitting out here today when they look at their deck, run it through that gauntlet? What should they be rethinking on something they just made minor adjustments with over the last 3 years, likely?
What is, as Casey McGlynn taught me, just always keep reducing risk and adding value. Okay, that's the job of the CEO. That's the goal. And what are the key risks? There are a million things you could be doing. What stands between this company where it is today and this company where everybody gets it? I mean, in your own mind, you say, why doesn't everybody get it that this company is brilliant and incredibly valuable, and every acquirer out there should buy us tomorrow if they were smart? What is the key risk or the key additional value that's going to make that happen? And then focus like a laser on that. I think that's what I would do.
Bernie?
Can you repeat the question, Joe?
Sure. So everybody here's got the fruitcake that's been passed holiday to holiday back and forth in form of their slide deck. If you had to say, listen, go back to your slide deck today, have the courage to reimagine what it should look like, what should they be thinking about? Like Hanson had just passed along. What should they be starting, just the top 2 or 3 things on that deck, if it's for M&A, if it's for investors, or it's attract talent?
So for the pitch deck specifically,
With a pitch deck.
yeah, I agree that it shouldn't be iterative. You shouldn't take what, in the context of this panel, a newly appointed CEO should start with a blank piece of paper, right?
If you're a new CEO, you're not there because everything's going right.
That's right. And we did this recently with On Target Labs with Bill Peters is in the audience here. Bill, we started with a blank sheet of paper, right? We didn't assume anything. We didn't carry over the past, the past message, and created a new, fresh message and set of priorities. And so far, it's going pretty well with that new approach. It's invigorating for the employees that have been there to see clarity and direction, and to your point, it helps with bringing new people on as well. New employees on, helps me customers, and clearly with new investors. So I would just reiterate: start with a clean sheet. Use your people. Use the best data and information that you can gather, and then put everybody in a room for a day and a half, 2 days, and start from scratch.
Cason?
Yeah, I would say you should take a stab at, in one single slide, even if it's a somewhat dense, wordy slide, being able to articulate the narrative of the company. If you can't condense that narrative down into a syllogism, like a very clear set of propositions that add up to a very compelling conclusion, you haven't tightened that narrative enough. The other piece of guidance I would say is you have to think about who your audience is and think about why they should care. Like, what is the psychological motivation that's going to get them to lean in to the narrative that you're telling? And often, you can think of fear and greed as motivators for a lot of, things that we're trying to do, whether it's raising money or selling a company. You have to be able to understand what is your audience really going to care about, and what's going to make them, what's going to earn you the right to their attention for the next 30 minutes or an hour or however long you're speaking to them. And you have to start with that. So I would just emphasize clarity, being concise, and then starting with what matters to your audience.
Given the, Hans, I'll go back to you. Given the forced voting, if you will, the forced decision-making in a room, if we've got that many critical thinkers, we're hoping there's a lot of conflict, healthy conflict in those discussions. But eventually you come out with those vital few. And then you've got to create, the CEO has this massive responsibility of creating trust across the organization after people come out. And some of those people will have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. Their agenda is not moving forward, and others will be happy. So how does that CEO at that moment in time start creating trust as a priority for their job description?
Fascinating, challenge. I spend a lot of time in the invention and R&D phase where we do a lot of brainstorming, and it's super important to make sure everybody feels empowered and that everybody can speak their mind, and that you can not only come up with good ideas, but tell other people why their ideas are bad. And that's immediately challenging. They feel threatened. You're telling them their baby's ugly. And no, it's about how we can make that better, not saying you're wrong, I'm right. So creating that kind of a discussion format is essential in this setting too, where everybody can speak up, everybody can challenge each other, but everybody needs to know and feel that it is about the good of the company, not about, establishing some sort of competitive hierarchy about who's the top dog in the company. And the top dog in the company, the CEO, can play a key role there in being, hopefully one of the quieter voices in the room. Mm-hmm. And letting everyone else speak up and letting everyone tell, me why I'm wrong. And that sets the tone. If I can do that and not feel threatened, then everyone else can do the same. And then you're going to have a really constructive discussion.
Cason, how does the leader regulate that distress in an organization on a daily basis, right? Because doing that, it sounds simple with that radical candor approach, but as the leader, how do you regulate that distress? And hopefully over time it dissipates.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to do that is instilling, and this is something that I think Duke does exceptionally well in the Ajax world, is creating a mentality within an organization of constant, perpetual forward motion. So I think what can get exhausting for an organization is if they get bogged down in decision-making process or disagreement, but go through that process, hash out the details, come to a decision, and then move. And I think people get excited and motivated by forward motion, and that requires a bias to action. It requires, being able to avoid the, paralysis of analysis issue that can, I think, plague a lot of organizations. So I think that's one way to mitigate that, is make sure that it doesn't linger and fester, and then create momentum again after you've made a decision and push the organization that direction.
Bernie, one of the principles that you have brought to the system, and we use it at TMG, and I know a lot of other organizations have, is if you can make a decision and it's close enough, make it and go.
Yes.
But then it requires a very rapid cycle.
Yes.
So take us through that. I found that fascinating as a leader over 40 years of leading an organization. It was almost a aha moment for me.
Yeah. I use a system and I coach and teach a system that, starts with that brainstorm, and then you form teams, right? Diverse, cross-functional, cross-geography teams on those most important things. And the idea is to go insanely fast, to get to a plan in 30 days and start executing on day 31. That requires a mindset of not letting perfect get in the way of good enough, right? So if I'm going to do a sprint plan, it's not going to, in 30 days, it's probably not going to be a perfect plan. It's going to be a good enough plan, but a good enough plan implemented, I think Patton said this immediately and violently, is better than a perfect plan and implemented, 6 months later, right? So because at day 31, you're getting, you're benefiting from execution on the right thing, and then having a system that's closed loop, right? That has a continuous improvement aspect built in. That also helps, I think, with folks that maybe don't see their item on the vital few. You can communicate to those folks that, look, on this cycle for these next 6 months or whatever, these are the boulders we're going to crush, and then we're going to refresh this. And if your item is important enough, it'll bubble up, right? So not letting perfect get in the way good enough is only good in a system that's closed loop, right? Otherwise, it's probably not a good idea.
And then that's really interesting. In case I don't want your point on this, because it plays the two of you are chatting back and forth. When I start to decide on a point here, but then I start to get activity and data, I start to circumambulate around that point and have a totally different perspective, whether it was on vital few or not. And so have you seen that occur in your experience?
Yeah. So, I mean, we were talking about trade-offs previously. And, as we think about strategy as an important, responsibility of the CEOs to control the strategy of a company, obviously in conjunction with the team, I think a definition of strategy is the prioritization of trade-offs that are effectively tuned to market dynamics or other inputs that are external to the organization. And so it's being able to adapt to changing dynamics that are external to your organization, to reevaluate the priorities that you have to make, to orient the resources and capabilities of your organization to value creation. That has to be iterative. And we saw that at Cortex to a significant degree. Like, electrophysiology is a market that is super dynamic right now, with the emergence of PFA as a new therapeutic modality that's taking a lot of market share. And so the needs of acquirers and what they're looking for is all very dynamic. And that was the environment we were operating in. And so a conversation with a strategic that tells you something new about the market dynamics, that has to flow back into the strategy formation as you're thinking about what the priorities ought to be.
Hanson, your thoughts on that?
Well, thesis of this talk is the first 6 months, but unfortunately, it goes on forever. Even if you do have exactly the right vital few and the team is executed, everything's great. I'll just mention perhaps the most famous piece of Silicon Valley business advice, which is Andy Grove saying, "Only the paranoid survive." So okay, you think everything's going right. What isn't going right? How could this be challenged, etc.?
Let's jump to board meetings. We've got 12 minutes left, and I want to leave a couple minutes open for Q&A. Let's jump to board meetings. And Bernie, you and I have a conversation outside the door from, you just came back from Hungary from a consulting gig. And when you start to focus on the vital few, and there's only a handful of deliverables and everything else is a secondary or tertiary matter, what should board meetings look like? Should they be taking up a week of your time to prep for a board meeting, then locking a bunch of people in a room that is usually a one-way discussion out of fear from the CEO's perspective, and then running through a deck that, again, probably should be refreshed? So what should the perfect board meeting look like?
Well, it should be a lean process in my view. One of the biggest wastes that I see in my journeys, having worked with over 60 organizations in this space, is companies that spend a month building their board decks, a whole month out of every quarter doing something that really doesn't add much value to the customer or the employee, and neither to the shareholder. When in the companies I ran, you would say we'd have a board meeting this afternoon, push a button, and go to the one-page strategic plan, which we call a success tree, and then with the vital few priorities, and then how we doing against those priorities in a very straightforward process kind of view. And then you always have other business, fundraising, new hires. Maybe there's IP issues or competitive issues or other things that you want to discuss. But it shouldn't be, preparing for a board meeting should not be a job for lots of people in your organization, and it shouldn't matter even how perfect the slides look, and or whether you even need a whole deck of slides to have an effective board meeting. I think effective board meetings are more about discussion, decision making, resource allocation, and finally, alignment. Right, bringing the shareholder into the strategy. I think that was mentioned by my peers, and so having that meeting to align on the priorities and giving the shareholder through the board, a voice in those priorities, I think is part of that exercise. So it's not sort of a one-way send. We've got 50 slides we want to send. It's more of a conversation.
Hanson?
I've seen CEOs who communicate on a weekly basis with the board. Here's what happened this week. Here's the new crisis. Here's a key issue I want us all to be thinking about. And so if you're doing that on such a regular basis, nobody needs to be brought back up to speed. What is this company making again? There's some shocking loss of knowledge if all you do is talk every 3 months.
Cason? Yeah, wearing the investor hat, I would say one of the biggest mistakes we see CEOs at times make with respect to board meetings is you'll have a 2-hour board meeting and they'll march through every detail across every function and then squeeze into the last 5 minutes the topics of fundraising, like when are they going to run out of money and how are they going to raise more money, and then like strategic engagement and anything related to an exit. The way we try to run our board meetings for our companies is recognize that an investor who invests in your company as a CEO, a number one job before anything else that I think we've spoken about, defining the vision, thinking about the strategy, building a team, driving pace with an organization, all of those things are subservient to the number one job, which is like keep the company solvent, like make sure you have cash so the company can survive and pursue an exit to get a return for your shareholders. We start with that. Like, how much cash do we have? Where is it going to get us? What are the milestones we're going to get to? What's the value creation associated with those things? What are the conversations we've had with potential buyers? Start with that. And then to the extent that there's questions that your board has about the details of your business, answer those in the backup or the follow-up or as those questions get asked. But answer the most pressing question that an investor is going to have up front. And I think that process actually puts people at ease, even if there is bad news, because they know you're thinking about it and you're stressed about it and that you're caring about their interests. It actually helps board meetings function a lot more smoothly and effectively, even in a scenario where there's bad news. Because I think a board member will feel anxiety in a scenario where they think the fundamental issue is being neglected. And that's you don't want your board member to be raising the fundamental issue about your business.
It's a danger zone. And then final question before we open up for a short Q&A. So, Michael Jordan had a series of coaches. Tiger had a series of coaches. Phelps had a series of coaches. Board members are not coaches for a number of reasons, from a legal liability perspective, as well as, sunshine perspective. Why, after venture organization may have paid large 6 figures to bring in a CEO, huge salary, do not today, very few get a coach outside the board for that CEO who has that sort of experience? The talent is out there in order to help coach them through these moments and for the emerging market and emerging leadership. Hanson, I'll start with you on this one. Give me a minute answer on why have we not moved to that yet when every other great performer has had a series of them?
Wow, it's a great question. I think just because people haven't thought of it. I think in many cases, especially when it's a first-time CEO or a physician CEO or so on, you do have an executive chair who is a board member, but also that CEO's coach, who's communicating on a nearly daily basis, help them learn the ropes, learn the company, learn the strategic framework, et cetera. So I think that is often the case, and I think it can work very well, especially in a smaller startup company.
But even Michael Jordan was at the top of his game, and he still had a coach. So I got you on the first-time CEO and the transitioning physician. But Cason, your thoughts on it? Why not?
Yeah, I mean,
Ajax do that.
well, I would say I've been in a very fortunate position because I've gotten to work so closely with Duke Rolene, who's got such an incredible track record in this space. I think I learned everything that I know about thinking about building businesses and defining strategy from him. But I would say only 10% of what I've learned from him has come from words that he's actually said to me. I think 90% has come from me watching him lead other organizations and sell companies and structure deals. And that's why I think for any CEO, whether you have a coach or you don't have a coach, you need to understand who you can imitate. But you need to imitate people in a dynamic way, because Duke has a very different personality than I have. And if I tried to do exactly what Duke did, it would feel inauthentic and fake, and it wouldn't work for me. But I need to understand how to take his personality and his approach and then adapt it and tailor it to my personality in a particular scenario. And it's not just Duke, but I think Scott Drake at Cordis, very different personality, different leadership style, but very effective. And I've got a ton to learn from him. And so I think that would be my guidance for any first-time CEO, is understand who are you imitating, and not just imitate them directly, but tailor that imitation to your own personality and your own set of capabilities. And then the last thing I would say is, at Ajax, we devour this podcast called How to Take Over the World, which just goes through like historical figures and what they did to be impactful. And it's because that same desire to like imitate success and understand who's done something really impactful in the world. What did they do to make that materialize, and what principles can we draw from that experience and apply to our own specific situations that we're in or that our companies are in. So I think that process of imitation is really important for a CEO.
Bernie, you've coached a lot of CEOs and had.
Yeah, I have, and I somewhat different way of thinking about it. I think teams need coaches, right? And you know, the CEO is part of that team, and you know, you think about team sports, right? In addition to having a coach, the coach always has a system, right? If you think about Nick Saban or any other, you know, successful coach, they're coaching a system, and that I think is an effective role for a coach, rather than sort of one-on-one with the CEO, but engaging the leadership team.
You always say a team with a system that are B players will 9 out of 10 times beat a team of A players who don't have a system.
Absolutely. Yeah. Plenty of examples of that in business and in sport. If you have a great system, that's a competitive advantage, whether that's, you know, on the gridiron, like Cason's background, or on an ice rink, or in business, right? You can a team of B players in an A system are going to beat a team of A players that are playing as individuals.
We've got a minute left. I wanted to leave a little bit more time, but any questions for the talent and experience on, please come to the microphone real quick. And if you have a question following this one up, stand in line behind the microphone, please.
Hi, my name's Astrid McNeilis. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for your time. Quick question. You said, I think it was you, Hanson, who said, you're not a new CEO because everything's going swimmingly. And then you said, Bernie, get input from the team that's there. But how, at the beginning, do you find out you're the new CEO with an existing legacy team? How do you figure out there's probably not just the CEO that's the problem. How would you quickly find out who are your people that are your A players versus your B players, and how do you deal with that?
I think that's a whole area we didn't dive into in the
only have
short time we had. But making sure, as Bernie taught me, you have the right people on the bus to really take the company where it needs to go. So understanding the strategic plan with the team and with the board and with your own research through other sources, et cetera. And then in order to execute that plan, who do you really need? And getting those people as quickly as possible.
Fair.
Yeah. Bernie?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's a lot to that. One, I think, is, are they a fit with the culture? I mentioned the vision, and then, kind of values, behaviors. Are they a fit there? Usually you see, your stars kind of emerge, I think, in those early weeks and months in the role, by using, by leveraging a process that's visible. You can see pretty quickly who can carry water and who just kind of doesn't. And so those are opportunities to, I think, look for the people that you want to promote and develop, and look for those people that you want to sort of unpromote or move away from. I think Hanson said it well in our prep call. We hire too fast and we fire too slow, and I think a newly appointed CEO really needs to look at that. If the players aren't a fit, don't take 6 months to make those decisions. Don't let you're never going to have perfect information on that. But anyway, hopefully that partially answers that question.
So I want to be respectful of the time here. We're at 0 now. Please, a hand for our